So over the past 2 years, I've made a couple of videos about this, but I've been tinkering with the P365 XMacro. From the tinkering, I've been playing with different configurations along the way. The first configuration I tested was the OEM out-of-the-box configuration. And honestly, out of the box, the integrated compensator that comes on the XMacro performed flawlessly, and it definitely helped eliminate the muzzle flip and the felt recoil that you typically get with smaller handguns. However, the factory grip module left a lot of things to be desired, which I'll cover in more detail as we go through the video. And because of that grip module leaving a lot to be desired, I decided to try out the Icarus Precision aluminum grip. And this solved almost every single problem that I had with the OEM grip. However, it created a new problem, and that's what brings us to today's video. And I wanted to share some stuff with you because I think I may have solved both of the problems of having a grip that leaves a lot to be desired and solving the problem that this one introduced with some new upgrades that have kind of just recently came out in the past few months. So not only are we going to go over what my experience was with a lot of these different upgrades, but we're also going to go over the pros and cons of them. And then later in the video, I'm going to tell you whether or not I would spend my own money on this knowing what I know now. But that also reminds me, I will have a parts list for every single thing that we're going to talk about in today's video. And the best way to find the parts list is the first link in the description. I'll also pin it in the comments section. And if you guys are watching this on your television right now, I'll throw a QR code up right here. Simply pause the video, scan the code, and you can scroll the parts list while you watch the video. If you guys could do me a huge favor, just hit the subscribe button. It doesn't cost you anything. I'd greatly appreciate it. So let's talk about the XMacro's biggest problems, because this will help guide us through this video on how to choose the best parts to solve the problems without introducing new problems. As I mentioned earlier, the OEM grip from Sig Sauer leaves a lot to be desired. There's nowhere to really rest your thumb of your support hand. There's no indexing points on either side of the grip module. Although the texture on the grip itself is really good, there's a lot of blank space where your support hand rides that simply is very slippery. Problem number 2 is because the slide has an integrated compensator on it, the slide gets incredibly hot. This isn't a huge issue unless you're shooting a lot of rounds at the range. However, when you decide to use an aluminum grip like this one to solve problem number 1 of the frame not having enough ergos and texture, those two things can interact, and then it introduces a new problem that I call heat transfer. So earlier, I said that when you have an integrated slide compensator combo, the slide gets really hot. But then when you have an aluminum grip module, that heat then transfers down into here. And when you're shooting a lot of rounds, you're having fun at the range, this thing can get incredibly hot, requiring you to wear gloves just so you can shoot it. Now, heat transfer from the comp to the slide can be solved by simply separating the comp from the slide. We'll go into more detail that in a second. And then solving the problem of heat transfer from the slide to the frame can be solved in 2 different ways. Either A, you only run a polymer frame, or B, you also separate the slide from the compensator so that the slide doesn't get hot, and if the slide doesn't get hot, it doesn't transfer into the frame as much as it does with the standard XMacro comp slide. And that all brings us to this guy right here. So this is my XMacro grip, but it's kind of a Frankenstein. This one has the Radian Ramjet Afterburner compensator on it. It also has the Radian backstrap magwell combo, and this one has these new base plates right here. Now, I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with the Radian Ramjet Afterburner or not, but these were first released a couple of years ago for the Glock platform. And I have tested a bunch of compensators over the years for the Glock platform, and some of them have been really great, and some of them have not been so great. And to be very honest, regardless if it's for the P365 or if it's for the Glock, the Radians have been my favorite go-to compensators for a multitude of different reasons. Number 1, it works with a wide variety of ammunition types, because some compensators won't work with certain grains of ammo, or sometimes they only work with high-powered ammo. Some of them can just have malfunctions if you don't use the right ammo. It even works with blazer brass, which on the back of the box right here actually says not to use with ported barrels or compensators. And the reason that these work with a variety of different types of ammo is when I spoke to the owner of Radian, he told me when they test these comps, they have to pass a few different ways. one of the main things that they have to do is they will go and get some of the weakest 9mm ammo that they can find. And then when they test fire these at the range, they only shoot them with their ring finger on the gun like this, and then pull the trigger. Essentially, they are shooting it with light ammo that typically shouldn't cycle the slide, as well as limp wristing it. And if you guys know anything about limp wristing, that can cause issues in some guns without compensators. They do a lot of R&D when they develop these. They're not just trying to make a product to just give out to people just for the sake of it. They're actually trying to solve a problem. And because of that, these are probably the most reliable compensators that I've ever tested. And that's really good if you're the kind of person that might want to use these in self-defense or concealed carry. The second reason that I like it, it is stupid easy to install. It uses one simple bolt that uses a star nut, and it locks into place very easily. You just crank that down, put it on, you're good to go. Third thing I like about them over other compensators that I've tested is they fit very snug against the slide. You know, in the past, I've tried some compensators and there's a little bit of a gap. It all depends on what barrel that you get with them, but this one doesn't seem to suffer from that problem. Fourth thing that I like about them is the barrels come in 3 different colors. You can get them in black, you can get them in bronze that we have here, or you can get them in a new color that literally just released, I think a few days ago, gray. And then the last thing that I like about these is they are 50 state legal because they're not using a threaded barrel. So in states that have threaded barrel bans, these are good to go. However, the most important reason that I like these the best, if you are the kind of person that wanted to use something like this for self-defense, these have been 100% the most reliable comps that I've tested. Now, as I was talking about earlier on solving the problems of heat transfer, when you disconnect the slide from the compensator, the heat won't transfer from the comp to the slide as much. Yes, they are technically touching because they're flush fit, but because there's a tiny air gap between them, your slide doesn't get as hot. And because your slide doesn't get as hot, it won't transfer to the frame if you happen to be using an aluminum frame like this. So you're probably tired of hearing me blab about the tech specs of this. How the heck does this compensator actually perform at the range? Well, when I first started testing this, I was using an aftermarket slide. I think it was a Lone Wolf slide. And on my first range trip, I had nothing but malfunctions regardless of what type of ammo that I chose. I was shot anything from 9mm 115 grain all the way up to 124 grain NATO rounds. And I had malfunctions no matter what I did, mainly just stovepipes. So I spoke to the owner of Radian asking him about this, and he said, you should do this with an OEM slide. So I went out and I purchased an OEM slide. And we'll talk a little bit more about this up close, because if you want something that looks like this, there's a few things you kind of have to follow to make it work, because this is, as you can see, a flush comp design. So after I got the OEM slide, I simply swapped it on there, put the barrel on, and went back to the range and continued to shoot another 430-ish rounds, I believe. And throughout all of that testing, I didn't have a single hiccup. No matter what type of ammo I threw at it, no matter if I was shooting indoors or outdoors, this thing ran like a top. I already know what some of you guys might be thinking or thinking about asking me. How does it compare to the Parker Mountain Machine comp? And for those of you that are unaware, they make a comp that's similar. And to answer that question, I can't really give you a fair answer. And the reason is the Parker Mountain Machine compensator that I have is designed for an XL slide. And when you install that comp that I have for Parker Mountain onto there, it turns it into an XXL. I made a whole video about that a while back. I'll throw a link right up here or down in the description so you can watch that video later. But it wouldn't be fair to compare the recoil characteristics of something that is more compact to something that is larger. However, I can make some other comparisons. Number one, the Radian is much easier to install than the Parker Mountain Machine, mainly because on the Parker Mountain Machine, you have to play with these little washers to make sure to get it to fit right. And that's just going to determine how snug it fits against your slide. And so if you don't use enough of those washers, your slide will slam into the comp. If you use too many, you're going to have more of a gap between the comp. With this one, there's just one setting, set it and forget it. Additionally, with this one, as I mentioned, it comes in 3 different colors, and that's only going to change the color of the barrel. With the Parker Mountain Machine, there's only 2 colors, but the only thing that changes colors is the color of the compensator, not the barrel, and those are available in black and flat dark earth. And honestly, this is a very subjective opinion, but I feel like the Radian simply looks better and is more aesthetically pleasing. So what are the pros and cons of the Ramjet? I've already kind of talked about a lot of the pros earlier, talking about how it works with a variety of different types of ammo and all that other stuff. What about the cons? Well, there is two big cons. The first one is going to be the pricing of it. Pricing of these is they're not cheap. They're about 389 doll hairs, but not to worry. If you go over to the parts list, I will have something that rhymes with the word chromopode. Flip the letters around, you'll figure that out. And that will actually make them cheaper than the Parker Mountain machines. With that said though, there is one other con that we've already discussed. That is, through my testing so far, they don't play nice with aftermarket slides, specifically the Lone Wolf ones. I don't have a bunch of P365 slides, so I couldn't test it with others, but I can say with this slide here, which is an OEM slide, it works perfectly. Now, with that being said, we need to dive up close. We need to talk about this setup in a little bit more detail. That way you kind of understand what all's going on with it. If you notice here, we have what I like to call a flush comp. If you would have had, say, a shorter frame, then this comp is gonna hang off the end. Similar to something like this. It would just hang off and it would kind of look funny. So, the reason I bring that up is over at the parts list, I will have information about the specific slide that I'm using on here, because it's a specific size that makes it flush with the XMacro frame. Which actually reminds me, I do want to give a big shout out to the boys at Brownells. They help this channel more than you guys realize. And the reason I even bring that up with this is they have all this Radian stuff that we are speaking about today, and I will have something over there that rhymes with the word chromopode, and it makes this stuff easier on the wallet, if that makes sense. Big shout out to those guys, love you to death. Now let's talk about the grip modules or the back strap that's on here, because I do want to kind of compare this to some of the Icarus Precisions, because there are pros and cons to both of them. So let's compare the back strap on an OEM frame to the Icarus aluminum frame to the Icarus Air. And I don't know if I've talked about the Icarus Air on this channel yet, but I've had this for a long time now and I've been testing the crap out of it. One of the downsides to the OEM frame, as I mentioned earlier, is a lack of ergos. Even with the different size back straps that come with these from the factory, they don't add like a hump right here if you were to want something like that. Also, you can tell up here, they are missing a ton of texture. And so your support hand can start to slide. And part of the reason why I'm able to run this as well as I do is because of this light. And so because there's no thumb ledge right here, you can add the light and that can act as your thumb ledge. It works really well in this configuration. Now, the biggest benefits to the backstrap magwell combo is number one, you get added ergos back here. No matter which backstrap you use from the factory Sigs, you can't get this much of a hump on it if you want. And one of the things that I've learned about Sigs is that little hump, although people hate them on Glocks, the Glock ones are lower down here. This one doesn't force you to change your grip, but it locks into here, into your palm, and that really helps your grip lock up on here. It also adds some really interesting texture to the backstrap that prevents slipping. And then obviously with any magwell, the biggest improvement for me is I like the grip improvements because it prevents your pinkies from slipping off. I guess the best part about this backstrap is they are the cheapest way to upgrade your grip if you're still using the OEM frame. I believe these are about 150-ish doll hairs or something like that. But this is probably, and I'm not talking about this to throw any shade at Radian, because I love Radian, I love the guys at Radian, but this is just a different animal. This is the Icarus Precision Ace XMacro. I'll have information about this at the parts list. But the biggest problems that this thing solves is it has a ton of good aggressive texture, but it's not so aggressive that if you were carrying this appendix inside the waistband that it would rub your stomach raw or anything. But they got very aggressive ergonomics on here. This back hump right here, it looks like it might be uncomfortable, but trust me, when you go to grip it, it locks your hand in. And then you have these huge thumb ledges on either side. And that is what gives you the most recoil mitigation control in your grip. Additionally, they have the integrated magwell that's built into this. And so that way you get a little bit of a better grip when you're doing this. Now, the biggest downside to these is the pricing of them. These are not cheap by any stretch of the imagination, but I will say this, they are 100% worth it. If money's not a thing to you, I say go after it. However, if money is an issue to you, and this doesn't solve the problems that you have, like you want a legit thumb ledge, there is a more affordable option, and that's this guy right here, and this is the Icarus Air for the XMacro. It's essentially a polymer version of this one with a few other differences. Number one, it has a ton of aggressive texture on here. The downside is they don't have that aggressive hump on the back strap. If you notice, this is more similar to the OEM grip, but it doesn't make that big of a difference, but you can feel the difference. One of the biggest differences on this, however, is you don't get this thumb ledge here on both sides. You get an indexing point on one side and a thumb ledge on the other. And what's good about that is if you're right-handed, the thumb ledge is on the left. If you're left-handed, you get the thumb ledge on the right. Or if you don't want thumb ledges, you can get indexing points on both sides. It also solves all the problems that this one solves, and it has the integrated mag well. But additionally, these are the cheapest grip modules or grip upgrades that we're gonna talk about today. But honestly, no matter which option you were to want to choose, they're all good. And there's not one I would say that's better than the other, because as soon as you step up to something that's a little bit better, the price goes up, and it's all gonna depend on personal taste and personal preference. Now, the next thing I wanna talk about is they did send out these base pads. And I'll be honest with you guys, I am not the biggest fan of swapping base pads just for the heck of it, unless they kind of solve a problem. Well, these do. They solve one big problem. The main problem that they solve is if you have any XMacro magazines, you'll know that these are 17 rounders. However, actually fitting 17 rounds into them is actually quite difficult, even after the magazines have been broken in. If you look at these up close, you'll see that there's a little bit more of a gap on the floor plate of the Radian versus the OEM. And I will say it is a lot easier to fit 17 rounds into here than it is with the OEM base plate. Now, I can fit 17 rounds into the OEM now that it's broken in, but the good news is they didn't design this magwell backstrap to only work with these base plates. I've actually experienced that with other brands on other guns before, where you get a magwell, but in order for your mags to work, you gotta buy their base plates. These are completely optional. This works perfectly with the OEM base plates, so you don't really gotta worry about that. But what about holster compatibility with these different types of setups? Are they gonna work? So this is my favorite holster. I've been talking about them for years, but this is the Tier 1 Concealed Axis Elite holster. Been using it forever, and this is made for a P365 XMacro with a TLR 7A weapon light. Now, with the OEM frame, it's 100% gonna fit. It fits with this compensator and with this shorter slide on it. Now, if you were to get the version that uses the longer slide, you might have a couple of issues. And in previous videos, I've even talked about it working with the XMacro frames as well. Despite having these big thumb ledges on them, they work perfectly well. And I was actually very surprised to see that. So if you were to want to conceal carry with this, I'm wearing a red shirt on purpose so you can see the shadows if there's any printing. But as you can see, nothing is printing at all. And it has really beautiful retention, and you don't got to take my word for it. This just happens to be my favorite holster. I haven't tested a ton of other brand holsters just because I like Tier 1 so much, but I do know 100% that these work despite which configuration that you want to put the XMacro in, unless you start extending the length of the slide. That's the only way it wouldn't fit. I'll have more information about that over at the parts list, as well as a chromo code. So now we got to answer two more questions. Number one, would I buy this knowing what I know now? And number two, if you are looking to do something like this, there's an expensive way to do it and there's a more affordable way to do it. Which way is the best? So number one, would I buy it knowing what I know now? And I think you already know the answer to that question. Yes, I would. As I mentioned, these are my favorite compensators and I love them to death. Now, when it comes to the backstrap and magwell, if I'm the kind of person that really likes the OEM grip, I would get this knowing what I know now because it does add a lot of functionality to it, but I'm the kind of person that really prefers thumb ledges. And so because of that, I probably wouldn't buy this because I do want a thumb ledge and this doesn't simply provide a thumb ledge. But if I was the kind of person that didn't care, 100% works great. So now for the next question, what's the most affordable way to put these together? Well, it really kind of depends, number one, on if you already have a P365, and number two, which P365 model you have if you already have one. For example, if you don't own a P365 and you're originally planning on getting a P365 XMacro, then you might want to hold off, because picking up a standard XMacro and then upgrading it with the parts that we have on here right now, would come out to $1,498 because you have to go buy a separate slide. The second way to do this is completely from scratch, meaning you get the fire control unit separate, you get the slide separate, you get the mag separate, and all that other stuff. If you went that direction, it would come out to $1,369, a little bit less because you don't got to buy an additional slide. But I've found the cheapest way to do this, if you don't already have a P365, is to simply buy a standard P365 X 3.1 inch. And it's their basic model, and it has the red dot ready slide. In fact, it's the same exact slide that I have on here. If you went that direction and you got all the parts that are on here, as well as picked up 2 XMacro magazines, because if you have a standard 365, you're not gonna have the XMacro mags. It actually comes out to like $1,273. Don't worry, I will have all this stuff listed out at the list. That way you can make the best decision possible for you. But the biggest advantage to doing it that way with the standard P365X is, number one, you will have a subcompact frame and subcompact mags. And that way, if you ever wanted to switch back and forth, you could do so. Or you could just get rid of the parts, sell them to a friend, and then you save even more money because you made money off the extra parts that you don't need anymore. I want you guys to understand, I have sample sizes of one of everything. I could have the one that worked phenomenally well, or I could have the one that fell completely on its face. I encourage you to do more research beyond my videos. You should take everything I say as a grain of salt because, number one, I make mistakes, and number two, I have low sample size. So feel free to search Reddit, Facebook groups, other people's videos and stuff like that. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments section. But until next time, guys, I love you, and you guys stay sexy.